When I used to do networking, I would have panic attacks. I would be like, oh my God, there's so many people. Like, I don't know small talk. Being able to build relationships and realizing that just because I am an introvert doesn't mean I still can't build those relationships. You have kind of your key points that you want to hit. You're not trying to kind of think of things on the spot. Like, where do I go next with this conversation? And alumni are much more likely to respond to that cold outreach. Where are you from? What do you do? Where did you go to school? Those three questions, you would usually find something in common with them within that. Being an active listener, not talking all about yourself, but letting them speak, it makes it that much easier where you're not having to kind of pull that information out of them. We're all human beings trying to learn, trying to grow, and be seen at the end of the day.
This is the Relentless Pursuit of Winning podcast, where we are here to educate, equip, and inspire people to build extraordinary companies. We're so glad you're here. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so that you can get updates every time we drop a new episode. Now let's get it started. Here we go with another episode of the Relentless Pursuit of Winning podcast. My name is Rick Meekins. I'm your host today. And in our studio, we have Justin Volman. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing good, Rick. How about you?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm appreciating this rainy weather here in Georgia. You said it's starting to get hot up there in Maryland, right?
Yes. Yeah. The DMV spring quickly turns into DMV summer. And it's a very quick shift. So yeah, the humidity's here, and thankfully it's not 90 and humid yet, but we're getting close.
I hear you. Folks, and welcome again to the show. If you haven't done it already, would you please like, subscribe, and hit the bell so that you can get updates every time we drop a new episode? And without further ado, let's get to it. So Justin, why don't you give us a little bit of background on who you are, what you do, and why you do what you do?
Of course. So a little bit of background on myself. I'm a third generation entrepreneur. So I saw my dad run his own solo practitioner legal practice for 35 years. In my earlier ages, I'm answering the phone at his law office and learned that customer service voice very quickly. And prior to that, my grandmother ran her own marketing company. So I got a really great first degree education on what it's like to be a business owner from a very young age, and was always at either my dad's office or my grandmother's office. And my grandfather worked for my dad for a period of time. So really got to see how businesses can be run and how they can involve family members and friends and just, grow organically that way. So I'm a third generation entrepreneur, a two-time founder. So I started my first business 10 years ago. I grew it to 200 people in 7 different countries over 3 years, and really led me into the HR strategy career that I'm in today. I really loved building those infrastructures, the company building, really just creating more opportunities for everyone in a specific space. And so ran that business for 3 years, then relocated to the DC, Maryland area, became an executive recruiter in the staffing world, saw all the different sides of it. And then prior to starting this new business last March, I did internal recruiting strategy for a local Maryland-based nonprofit and helped them double in size from about 450 employees when I joined to over 1,000 now. And so over this last decade, I've become a 4-time award-winning HR strategist and company builder who's hired over 1,000 people across 7 different countries in less than 10 years. So it's been a busy last decade. I grew up in Connecticut originally, and then did my undergrad at the University of Alabama, where I started my first business and met my now wife, and now have been based in the DC, Maryland area for the past 7 years now.
Wow, that's beautiful. I love this conversation. And like last time, you just say these things so humbly. I built a 200-person everybody does that. I know it,
No, I definitely get that. Thank you. I appreciate that. And being a 2-time founder, I learned a lot from running that first business. I was a college student who just didn't know what he didn't know and had 200 people looking to him for the answers. And, I didn't have them. So I've tried to really make sure I have a solid foundation for this new business that I started last March, Volman HR strategy, and really take all the knowledge that I've gained from whether it's hiring for my first business, hiring for others' businesses as a third party, or hiring internally. I've kind of seen it from all different angles. And so really the focus of Volman HR strategy is to take the frustration out of attracting, hiring, and retaining talent for businesses, while also taking the frustration out of the job search for job seekers. So at the end of the day, trying to build a bridge between the two and make it easier for those employers that need their talent to move that business forward, and make it easier on those job seekers that are looking for those opportunities to move their lives forward as well.
Yeah, that is so critical. Like with today's job market, it's just so tough. I just keep hearing the stories over and over. As I got to my last interview and they select somebody else, and it's heartbreaking to hear.
Yeah, 100%.
I want to hear about like some of your early lessons though. You talked about your grandmother's marketing firm. What was a story in your life where, that it impacted the way you think about business now?
Yeah, so I think both with my grandmother's business and my dad's business, I really saw how employees could become kind of members of the family. They could become friends that, they talk to for years. Great example of that is my grandmother had this great person that was working for her. My grandmother became like a bit of like a surrogate mother for her. And this employee was getting married and she invited, my grandparents and me and my brother to the wedding. And so we went to the wedding of one of my grandmother's employees. And the other side of my dad, he just sold his practice at the end of this last year. He had the same paralegal for probably 30 out of the 35 years that he was running that business. And she was at all my bar mitzvah, my brother and my bar mitzvah. She was at our different family events and graduation parties and just really saw how, you can really build those bonds within an organization that can really become friends, family, long time people that they're not just your employees anymore. They're family friends, they're close confidants. And so that was, I think, a really big lesson I learned very early on is you need to really treat the people that work for you like you would your family members. And obviously, if
Mm.
you treat your family members well at the end of the day, it's all
Yeah.
about treating people how you want to be treated at the end of the day. And I think I saw how my dad and my grandmother treated all their employees with kindness and understanding. And I think it really reflected in just the longevity of the employees that would stay there decades. And just, people just really enjoyed working for my dad, for my grandmother. And so that was a really big thing I learned from a very young age. And another lesson I learned, I think the reason I'm now a two-time founder is I saw the freedom that being your own boss, had. I think it was always, my dad did not make looking or being a lawyer look like fun. He always talked about how he did not like being a lawyer, but
Yeah.
I think the things that he enjoyed was having that freedom. And we could always line up his vacations with our school vacations. He was always able to come to our different sporting events and things of that nature. And
Yeah.
um, that was the part that was always, I think, really attractive to me was building something on your own and really having that freedom to, not have to answer to anyone and just really be able to build the vision that you see fit. And my dad, he's a multi-time founder too. He was halfway through, maybe about 15 years ago, he got to that point where he's like, maybe I could run a sports bar because he's a big sports fan. And him and my uncle and another couple of people went
That's
in on it,
scary.
and it didn't go well. It was they shut their doors after a year.
Yeah.
But that I think was a good lesson for my dad that just because he's good at one sector of business doesn't mean that it's necessarily successful in another side. So,
That's a
I've kind
tough
of
industry,
seen
though.
what it is. Oh yeah, the restaurant industry is very tough. Even when my dad was thinking about that, I was like, "Are you sure you want to do that?" And I was in high school at the time. I was like, "Are you sure? That's a lot." He went through with it, and I think it was a good experience for him. But
Uh,
I've seen those lessons of businesses that succeed, businesses that fail, and learned a lot from both sides and kind of what leads to success or what leads to failure. And it just always gave me that resiliency as well to like your business fails, that doesn't mean that, you have to be a failure the rest of your life. You can pick yourself up and build that next business.
you talked about employees and treating employees like family, and I love that. My team, they've always been my different teams. Over the years have been very very important to me, and I've been involved, in their lives. The opposite side of that though is those difficult employees. Did you have an opportunity to see like your dad or your grandmother have to deal with someone that or some folks that just weren't a good fit for the organization, and how they handle that?
Yeah, so my dad definitely dealt with that a couple of times. Mainly, it seemed to be, or this one example was an attorney. So he brought another attorney for his firm, and the attorney, unfortunately, started stealing and was not doing things ethically, and so my dad had to let him go. And the guy went and started his own firm and was still doing the same not great things. And so I think I've seen my dad and my grandmother and my grandfather were always willing to give people one,
Yeah.
two, three chances. They're always trying to help people. There was, I think, a good example of one of the paralegals that worked for my dad and my grandmother at different times. 10 years before they hired him, he was a lawyer himself and got, in trouble for embezzling from clients' accounts and, served time for it. And they didn't hold that against him. They, gave him that chance to, be able to rebuild his career and his life.
Mm.
And, he was at my engagement party last year. And so it kind of
Wow.
shows that, when you give people those second chances, it can really pay dividends, in the long run. And, but I definitely saw my dad have those tough conversations, whether it was with clients or with, employees. I mean, I think another good example of this is, the paralegal that has been with him for 30 years. At one point, he had also hired her sister. And so he had both, they were both working as paralegals for him. And, at one point, the business had a downturn, during the '08 recession and the housing crisis. And he had to, lay people off in his office. And one of them was, this paralegal sister. And,
Mm.
it could have been, a horrible situation. The paralegal could have also decided to leave, you're getting rid of my sister, I'm gone too. But I think the way that my dad, approached it, and was really like, if I could keep you on, I would, because, I've really enjoyed working with you. It's just, a result of the economy and, where we're at as a business. And so, that person, that paralegal still stayed with my dad for, decades longer, and, didn't hold that, against him, that, he had to lay off her sister. And so I think that, just kind of shows when you treat people, as human beings, and you understand that, they're not just kind of, robots or worker bees that can come in and just, be expected to do everything and not be affected by the things in their personal lives. I think that's something I always saw as well, where my dad and my grandmother and my grandfather really gave their employees grace to, deal with things, from a personal standpoint. And,
Yeah, that's
if they need to
so
come in
important.
late, or they need to go to a doctor's appointment, or take their, mother to a doctor's appointment, or their husband, or whatever it might be, that always came first. Family always came first, business came second. And I think that was always a really important lesson to learn as well as a business owner is, we're not just our businesses, we're more than that. And, I think at the end of the day, no one's like, oh, I wish I'd worked more at the end of my life. It's always, I wish I'd done, more with friends, family, the things that they love at the end of the day. And so I think that was another really important lesson, that, business is not first, families first. And, it's really important that you have those clear separations, and not, let the business side, blend into the personal side, and vice versa.
Yeah, yeah. That's a tough one. You put so much effort, as a leader, as a founder, I mean, you've got to put effort into investing in your team, into, being loyal to them and building that trust and that sort of thing. And then you get to the point where, as you described in 2008, you have to do some layoffs.
Yep.
And the layoffs in that situation aren't just, they're not numbers. These are people that that you work with every day. What did you learn from watching your father have to lay off, part of his team? How did
Yeah.
that go?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely tough, especially during, that housing crisis. I mean, a lot of my dad's business was in the real estate market, and so when that dried up, it was definitely, lean years, from a business perspective. And,
Mhm,
I think what I learned from seeing my dad go through that was, he didn't necessarily let it affect, how he was, treating me, my mom, my brother, when we were at home. He wasn't,
mhm,
taking the frustrations out of the economy, on us. And, just being able to kind of separate, the business from the home life, I think, was really important. But also just seeing how he kind of, was able to steer the ship through this crisis and build the business back up, and, get it back to where it was. And, he did such a great job, I think, of investing in talent, throughout the years, where he was always having high school students or law students or college students, intern for him, and,
mhm,
learn things from him. And, at the end of the day, when he sold his practice, at the end of this past year, it was to a law student who 20 something years ago had interned for my dad, heard that
mm,
my dad wanted to retire and sell his firm, and bought the firm for my dad. So,
yeah,
I think I also saw how investing in that talent, at a very, early stage from a company, can really pay off dividends in the long run when you develop it, and you're trying to, really have that servant mindset, where you're always trying to figure out, okay, how can I help someone else, get the same opportunities that I have? I think I saw that a lot with both my grandmother and my dad. And I think the reasons that they did it was, my grandmother was the first, member of her family to go to college. Both of her parents are immigrants. They didn't speak English, and she was the first one to graduate college, and did so when pregnant with my dad. So she was able to, go through with that, and, go through that challenge. And, my dad, always likes to say, him and his, my grandparents, they didn't have a lot of money growing up. They were always, trying to figure out how to help people. And even though they didn't have money, they were always, helping out other people's friends and family members, and just, giving them that, extra leg up. Because my grandfather, he had to basically kind of take over the family when he was 15, because his dad
mm,
died when he was 15 years old.
mm,
And so he had to drop out of high school, and, support everyone in his family. And so I think that just ingrained a really, work ethic within all of our family members, but also that caring mindset of, we're not going to leave anyone behind. We're going to try to, lift everyone else up as well with us. And so those are, definitely some really important lessons that I learned from, just seeing that, you need to treat people as people, because you never know, how you treat someone can pay off, in good ways down the road. So, I definitely learned a lot, by seeing those situations.
I bet, I bet. One of the challenges that we face as entrepreneurs, especially in the startup phase, is being able to manage the different areas of our lives. We've got our business and we've got our family. What do you think is a great approach to being able to, I don't know,
To
I'm not going to
balance it
use the
all,
term
to kind of
balance, but
separate it. Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
synchronize it, if you will.
No, I definitely, agree with that 100%. And I think, that was one of the mistakes I made with my first business, and that led to me being burnt out, where I was, working, all the time. There wasn't that separation from work and, personal life. And, at the time I was running, 200-person company, everyone else, everyone was remote. So, usually the most times we could meet was like Sunday nights. And so there just wasn't that separation of, the personal life and the professional life. And part of that was, being a college student, trying to balance, courses and graduation and running a business and, all those different things. And so, I've really been cognizant since I started this business last March to really not, make those same mistakes and really create those boundaries where, I've worked from home, when it was my first business during COVID, for other businesses as well. And, with this business too. And so I think it's really important, especially for those of us that, work from home, you need to have those separations. And so at 5 o'clock every night, I'm turning my email notifications off. I'm not seeing anything until the next day. And I think that's important, especially if you're
Mhm.
not, an EMT or, an ER doctor, the difference between responding to that email in 24 hours or not is not the difference between life and death. And so I think that's always an important boundary that I really try to set where, if I have an early networking event one morning, maybe I'm going to, start a little bit later the next day and just, kind of
Mhm.
being that, boss you wish you would have had, being that good boss to yourself, I think is very important. I think we can't sometimes forget that when we're those business owners that, even though we are our own bosses, we're our own bosses. So we can treat ourselves with, kindness and respect and not make us work till, 2 a.m. every night and then be up at 5 a.m. I think setting those boundaries are so important because, if you're burnt out and you can't run the business, efficiently and effectively, the business
Mhm.
is going to suffer. Your team
Mhm.
members are going to suffer. And so it's really important just to make sure that you have that strong work life balance because, like I said earlier, no one wishes they would have worked more at the end of their lives. They wish they would have
Mhm.
done, other things and done things that they loved. And so, I think that that's been a really big key part of it is just really making sure that I have that clean separation. And even though I'm
Yeah.
working in the same place that I'm living, I'm trying to get out of that work mindset, shutting my email notifications off, my LinkedIn notifications. I'm not seeing anything business related, until I turn those email notifications off the next day when my alarm goes off. So that's been a really big thing that I've been really cognizant of, since I started
Mhm.
this business last March to really prevent, just that feeling of burnout, feeling of, being drained and just feeling like there's no separation between, the business and the personal.
Yeah. 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 I always think about burnout also from the perspective of progress.
Mhm.
It's like, we're doing the thing, we're out here, we're grinding every day, and it's just like, I am not, seeing this needle move. Have you ever gone through that
Definitely.
type of
Yeah, I mean, with my first business, it was college students trying to pitch to Major League Baseball organizations of why we wanted to do scouting differently. And, not that they were doing anything wrong, but just that there was not enough people to see all the players that they were trying to see. Where there is, one scout seeing three states and, you can't be everywhere at once. You can't, be, 20 different games at once. And so, it took, some time for the needle to move on that side. But I think, the thing that I saw for both that business and this business was, networking, the connections I was able to make. And so,
Mhm.
the impetus for that first business was I did a internship with the one of the Cape Cod League summer baseball teams, and basically was the liaison between the team and all the Major League Baseball scouts. So I was able to make a lot of great connections. Really develop a lot of those ideas while having those conversations with those different scouts or Major League Baseball executives. And then I did a sports technology internship for a company called TrackMan, where I met a couple other interns who ended up founding the company with me. And so I was able to really find people that, thought similarly to me and really, allowed me to, kind of, build the organization up. But I think, it kind of all comes back to those, conversations where, the client that my first Major League Baseball client was someone that I met, when I was a Cape League summer intern and we continued the conversation and, he was interested in, what I was building. And so, having that, just that approval, from a Major League Baseball, team, I think really helped set, us on this road to success. Going back and looking at it now, I wish I had done, kind of not industry, division exclusivity, kind of like, turn the competitive against each other and be like, whoever signs up with us first is the only one in the division that can, get this data. And probably would have made a couple of the other teams move a little bit quicker. But definitely learned a lot from that experience. And, similarly with this new business, my first client for this was a result of networking. I was on a TEDCO webinar call, just to learn about their different investment programs. And another person was on it. He's like, oh, I'm a company scout for a technology company. I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. Let me follow up and chat with that guy. Met with him, learned he was a SCORE business mentor. And he's like, oh, I'm supporting this mental health therapy practice in Virginia and Maryland. They need some HR help. Would you meet with them? Met with that therapy business owner, and that became my first client. So I think the kind of the through line through each of the two businesses that I've started has been really about building those relationships and just showing up and connecting with people. And it doesn't come naturally to me. I'm not an extrovert. My dad is the extrovert. My grandmother, my brother are. They'll walk into any room and within seconds they're talking to, every person in the room, strangers, doesn't matter if they know them or not. Whereas I definitely take more after my mom, where she was a college librarian for a number of years, definitely more introverted. And so it's really something I've had to learn. It's not easy for me to, go into a room of people that, I don't know. I have to really, kind of psych myself up and, get myself into that, networking headspace to, be able to, be successful in that side. So I think that's the thing that I really saw is, how I could make it a skill, from a networking perspective and just,
Yeah.
being able to build relationships and realizing that just because I am an introvert doesn't mean I still can't build those relationships. And, I think that was a really big thing that really helped both of the businesses, grow was just really, showing up, connecting with people and, just showing that I'm in this for the human side too. I'm not just in this to, make a lot of money and then be done and leave everyone behind. I really want to make sure that, for both of my businesses and, the work that I'm doing that, I'm leaving the space better than it was before.
Do you have tips for people, like for introverts? Like what has made you successful in, just connecting with people? I mean, you've got a great, personality and way with people, very authentic way. But I mean, what are some things I find we find a lot of times, people have their 5 steps, you need to do this. What have you learned? What's been your experience? What's worked for you?
Yeah, great question. So I think, at the end of the day, a lot of times I have the same conversations with different people, and that makes it a little bit easier. Going back to my campus recruiting days, I was talking with lots of students on a regular basis, telling them about the organization that I was a part of and why they should come work at this organization. And so I think, for lack of a better term, a script, you have kind of your key points that you want to hit. It makes it a little bit easier. So that way you're not trying to kind of think of things on the spot and, you're
Mhm.
not trying to be like, okay, where do I go next with this conversation? I found that to be really helpful where it kind of becomes more of that like learned habit where you're like, okay, these are the questions that I want, answers to, these are the things I'm going to ask, but still keeping it in an organic, relatable way. So it's not like I'm putting them through a, list of, pre-selected questions or something of that nature. So that's been really helpful. And I think the other biggest thing that I've learned is, rejection is okay. If that person doesn't respond to that message, it doesn't mean that, they hate you or that they'll never
Mhm.
buy from you. Sometimes they just miss it. And it's okay to follow up with people and, check back in. But another big thing that and I help this with job seekers as well, is try to find people that you already have multiple things in common with. And so I
Mm.
love, using alumni bases as an example of that, where for a lot of people, those 4 years as an undergrad are some of the, ones they think on most fondly of their lives. And so I've always found alumni are much more likely to respond to that cold outreach because you already have multiple things in common with them. You went to the same university, you're in the same industry. And I think that makes those conversations easier because you're
Mhm.
not going into it kind of blind of like, oh, I don't know anything about this person. They know nothing about me. We have nothing in common. You already have something in common. You already have something that you can kind of build that relationship from. And I saw that with my dad, throughout the years. He usually asked, the same three questions to every stranger he would meet. Where are you from? What do you do? And, where did you go to school? And within those three questions, he would usually, find something in common with them within that. And so I think that's the really another big important thing that I found is, listening and just being an active listener and just not
Mm.
talking all about yourself, but really showing that you're interested in learning about them and just kind of letting them speak. Because I think that's where you learn the most is when you let someone kind of talk about themselves and what are their challenges, what are the things that are going well. And, it makes it that much easier where you're not having to kind of pull that information out of them. They're just,
Mhm.
kind of giving it to you willingly. And so I think that that was a really big thing that I had to learn was just, it's okay if someone does, says no and just doesn't want to have the conversation. There's going to be, hundreds of other people that, do want to have that conversation and are willing to, give that time. And those are the people that you want to surround yourself with at the end of the day. When I started
Mhm.
my first business, or not this first business, but when I started this business last March, before I started it, I talked with a lot of other consultants in the space just to learn, how did they build their businesses? What led them to success? And, so many people were so generous with their time with me. And, the thing that always kept coming back was referrals, building that network, those centers of influences that can send you business. And I saw that
Mhm.
with my dad for a number of years and my grandmother's business, just the relationships that you're able to build, with your
Mhm.
businesses,
Mhm.
can come back in, incredible ways. And another great example of this is I interned with someone at TrackMan now, you know, 10 years later. One of his best friends is local to this area. He now runs his own HR company and we connected and now we're in the same fantasy baseball league again. And he's like, how did you know like these things? I was like, oh, I was friends with your friend. And so it's amazing, kind of how, the world is, not as disconnected as we think it is. There's so many
Yeah.
things that link us and bond us. And, I think also just realizing that, everyone's a human being at the end of the day. Just because that person's, older than you or in a position that's higher than you doesn't mean you can't have a conversation with them, because we're all human beings. We're all trying to learn. We're all trying to grow and, be seen at the end of the day. And so I think that's one of the biggest things that I've kind of approached the networking side that's been helpful for me, but also having like a networking, partner or buddy that you can go with who's like,
Mm.
have you met this person? Or, Justin, you should meet this person. That's always helpful,
Yeah.
especially if you're, struggle to kind of initiate those conversations, having someone with you that maybe is a little bit more extroverted or just a little bit more familiar with the group of people that you're meeting with, that
Hmm.
can go a long way and just kind of help. So that way it doesn't feel like it's just you against this group of people. You have someone that can be kind of that, networking partner, and just make things a little bit easier at the end of the day for you.
Good stuff. Good stuff. I love the active listening. That's just
Yep.
I find that to be so critical. That's so critical. You've been down the so you've been on the entrepreneurial journey, for
Mhm.
quite a while, and you've been through the entire life cycle. You start business, you grow it, you get to a certain point, you close it, et cetera, et cetera. What are some important things, as an entrepreneur, we can learn from your experiences?
Yeah, great question. So I think the first and foremost thing, and this is something I saw with both of my businesses that I started, is just how many resources that are out there for business owners from a completely free perspective.
Mm,
So when I was an undergrad, I utilized the University of Alabama's, entrepreneurship incubator. I actually ended up winning the startup competition through the university. It didn't cost me anything to enter, but I was able to, win a good amount of money that was able to, move my business in the right direction. And so I think that that's a really big thing that, is just taking advantage of all the resources that are out there. With this new business that I started last March, I utilized the small business development centers in Maryland that are, all throughout the US, as well as SCORE, which is a great, free business mentorship resource. And so, I honestly wish I had utilized those resources more when I started my first business. I just didn't really know about them, but,
mhm,
I made sure to know about them before I started this second business. And so, I think that that's a big thing that I always try to help, other, fellow new entrepreneurs or business owners learn about, is just all the great resources that are out there that don't have to cost you an arm and a leg. You don't have to take out, a loan against your house to, have someone look over your business plan or, look over your, contracts or agreements. There's, lots of organizations out there, providing free support that can really, help make a difference. In that way, you feel like you're not just building it, all on your own. So that's definitely something I always try to help, new entrepreneurs and business owners, just all let them know about all the resources that are out there that are designed to help you succeed. And,
mhm,
whether it's free trainings or free webinars, I think, SBDC and SCORE do a great job of both, where you can learn about the things that, maybe you aren't sure about. You can get connected with those subject matter experts that can help walk you through it. And it's not going to cost you, anything at the end of the day. So that's a big thing that I always like to share with other, new entrepreneurs, is just, this is how you kind of get the name out there. This is how you, connect with people, and just, how important networking is. If you're just, by yourself and you're not telling anyone about your business or anything, no one's going to find out about your business. No one's going to know about it. Especially in today's, super digital age, attention spans are so short that, people just aren't, kind of grasping information like they used to. And so
mm,
I think it's so important just to kind of, be showing up, going to different networking events, coming to different things. There's so many free events out there as well that, maybe you're the only one in your industry that shows up to that. And then you're the person that everyone wants to talk to because you're the only person, from that industry there. And so I think that's been another big thing that I've learned that's been really helpful, is just the power of connection and the power of building that network where people can then send you business. There's people that are thinking of your business, even when you're not in the room, and thinking, this person would be a good person to send, Justin's way. And, I think just the benefits of, being able to build those relationships. I was actually just at a Montgomery County had a annual barbecue, or Montgomery County Society of Human Resources Management had their annual barbecue last night and invited all the other local SHRM chapters. And there was a bunch of people that I, had recognized and were friends with, but there were also two people that, I'd helped for free when they were unemployed as job seekers. And they were there then with jobs, and or Justin, not sure if you remember me. And I did remember them. And they were like, oh, I'm in this job. I'm doing great. And, that just makes it so, that makes it all worthwhile. Even though I'm doing that side for free, I'm investing in people and betting that, these people are going to find jobs and they're going to go on and do great things. And, they're going to think kindly of the times that I helped them when I didn't have to. And, even when I was there, one of the job seekers was like, oh, my friend's coming tonight. Could you meet with them? They're looking for a change too. So, I think when you show people, like you said, that genuineness, and you show that you're there to, care about them and you want to help them, I think that really makes the difference, especially in today's world where everyone's like, what's in it for me? Sometimes you need to ask, what's in it for you? How can I help you? How can we help each other?
Yeah.
because it's lonely as an entrepreneur, especially if you're running your own business and you're a team of one like I am. No
Hmm.
one understands the stresses of being an entrepreneur like a fellow entrepreneur. So I just find it so beneficial to connect with other people in the space and just talk about the challenges that we're going through. And so that way it's not as isolating. You feel like, oh, I'm the only one going through this issue when, it's an issue that, every business owner goes through and they need, to see what, the other business owners did to, solve that issue and what worked for them and what didn't work for them. And it'll save you a lot of time at the end of the day too, because you won't have to go down those rabbit holes that, already didn't work for that other individual. So another thing is collaboration, finding those partners, finding those people that, they're either do similar or different parts of the industries to you and seeing how you can, grow each other's businesses at the end of the day. I found that to be really beneficial and has really helped, this new business take off, by partnering
Hmm.
with other, solopreneurs or other small business owners in different areas and seeing how we can collaborate and send business each other's way.
Hmm.
That's been, I think, a really big part that I've really tried to focus more and more on, with this new business and seeing how we can collaborate and, just build more partnerships to, make it easier for everyone at the end of the day.
Yeah, partnerships. I think that's so important. Do you now? You've also closed. You closed one of your businesses, and I'm sure there were a lot of learnings around that as well. Can you share some of those?
Yeah, of course. So, when I was in the process of shutting down the first business, I did have a couple potential buyers lined up. And I wish I had gone about the process a little bit differently. I probably should have done more forward thinking from like a financial projection standpoint and just kind of showing the value of the organization because, I had these two buyers lined up, but they both wanted to offer me, no money up front and wanted me to keep running the business. And so I think a lesson I learned very early on is okay, if the business can't survive without me, then it's not going to be something that I can sell. And so I think that was something that I, learned the hard way. But, I probably would have had to shut down the business because of COVID anyway, just with amateur sports being canceled at that time.
Yeah.
But, it was tough. It was tough having to tell all the scouts and people that worked for me that I believed in me that, I was going to have to shut the business down. And, I tried to be as transparent with them as possible, letting them know that, funding wasn't great. We were, kind of struggling from a financial aspect. And, at one point my management team was like, don't tell us these things. And I'm like, but I want you to know, like, I'm not trying to pull the rug out from under you and just, have this come, out of shock. I want you all to know that, this isn't easy. This is, I always made sure that everyone else was paid before me. I didn't take any pay or salary from my first business because I wanted everyone else to be paid. And, they were doing work for me that, I wanted to compensate them for. So,
Nice.
that was a really, lesson that I learned that, with this new business, it's just me, so I can pay myself now. So that also is important. Like I do a lot for other people, but I also need to make sure I take care of myself as well, be able to pay my bills and, things of that nature. But I definitely learned a lot when I shut down that first business and, wish I had been able to position it further for sale or even, tried to have it be kind of acquired by one of the Major League Baseball teams that was one of our clients. So I think that could have been a good way to, have that data live on, but, didn't know what I didn't know. I was a,
Yeah.
college student trying to sell a business to, other, business owners. And, at the time I was kind of on a time crunch because I was moving to Washington, D.C. at the time with my now wife. And she had gotten into American University's master's program. So we needed to find an apartment in DC. And, they need that solid proof of income of, okay, this is how much you're going to make and how you can afford this rent. And my wife was a, master's student. So she didn't have a full-time job. And so, I needed to find a job that, could pay me a salary, could give me health insurance. And that way I could, get that, apartment to rent for us. And so, it was kind of, a lot of different things happening all at once. We were moving from Alabama to DC. It just felt like a time of transition and a time where I was like, the stress is too much. It's not worth it anymore. Because sports for me had always been an escape. It was always one of my favorite things. I was raised a crazy Boston sports fan in Yankee territory. So that
Uh-huh.
fandom and sports was always a big part of my life, from a very early age. My dad's been to every Patriots Super Bowl since I was born, except for this last one. I've been to a couple with him. He's gone to World Series games, finals games. Like sports was just always such a big part of our lives. And
Hmm.
so when it became my everyday from a business perspective, you get exposed to some of those uglier sides of the business and it just doesn't
Yeah.
become as enjoyable anymore. And so I think that's also a thing where, people are like, oh, you should find what you love. And, I do really enjoy what I'm doing, but you still need to have it not be that thing that was that escape for you. So,
Yeah.
with my HR business, I still do work with sports organizations. I'm a youth lacrosse coach evenings and weekends, but it's not my all day every day. I'm not only focused on this specific, sports industry. And so I'm, allowing myself to, enjoy it again and, not feel like, oh, I wish I could have done this or this, but, just being okay with failing because, you talk to any business owner, entrepreneur, they failed more than anyone. And, they get back up, they, build a new business and it's what you learn, from those failures that I think is really the key. And so, I think I learned so much from that first business that I've really tried to, make sure that I have that solid foundation, going forward with this business and just, really seeing how I can, better position it down the road to, do a sale and, similar to how my dad sold his practice or other people sell their businesses. I want to have that, lasting impact, on all the blood, sweat, and tears that you put into, your business at the end of the day. So that was definitely a lesson I learned, when I ran that first business and having to shut it down. Unfortunately, it was nothing related to any of the efforts of, the people that were working for me. It was really just a big transition point in my life and, something that, unfortunately needed to, close so another door could open and I could, find, a different career and find ways to kind of do what I was doing in the sports side, but, more broadly for, more businesses and, help them like I've helped, other organizations from a talent identification standpoint.
Mm, mm, mm. That's really courageous. I talked to a number of entrepreneurs that they feel like they've gotten to the point where the business is running them, and so
Mhm.
they've got the employees and that sort of thing, and they won't make that decision, that personal decision, to say, hey, you know what, I need to step back from this because I'm dying here, or
Mhm.
whatever that was. It's tough, and
Yeah.
because it feels like failure.
Yep. Yeah.
We alluded to the emotional weight of being an entrepreneur, a number of times, and sometimes it's just like getting up every day and showing up. Or as you talked about, going to the networking event, being an introvert, knowing your social battery only lasts a certain amount of time,
Yep.
et cetera, et cetera. One of the important questions I've asked folks and would love to get your input on is what are the things that you do to protect or maintain your emotional stability so that you can show up, so you can do all the things, so that you can make the right decisions, for your business. You can know when you need to step back sometimes and say, hey, I need a break. I need to get out of here. What are some thoughts you have on that?
No, that's a great point. And I think, the biggest thing that I've seen the importance of is, taking care of your mental health like you do your physical health. Because, I've been in therapy for, over 12 years, since went to college, I've been, under psychiatric care since then too. And so, I think, a lot of times people are like, oh, I'm not feeling well, physically, whether, it's stress related to ulcers or things of that nature, but that dealing with that underlying cause of, the anxiety, the depression, the imposter syndrome. And so I found it so beneficial, to really make sure that I'm taking care of my mental health. I meet with my therapist at least once a month, see with my psychiatrist because, I've seen how, detrimental, that those mental health issues can be and how, much of a struggle that they can be to your point. If, your brain is telling you that you shouldn't get up, out of bed that day, it makes it a lot harder to, run that business. And, it makes it that much more difficult to, lead that group of people that you're trying to lead as well. And so that's been a really important thing for me has been, really making sure that I'm taking care of my mental health. And I think it's just always helpful to have a third party kind of look at things for you and be like, I know it feels like the end of the world for you, but think about, and my psychiatrist said this to me, a month or so ago. She's like, you just turned 30. These are all the things that you've done and you just turned 30. Like you're doing incredible. Even if right now in this point, it doesn't feel like it. You ask any, you would have quizzed 5 people on the street right now, they'd all say, oh, this person's doing incredible. And so I think, that's been really helpful for me to just have someone that's not as, like you said, emotionally invested in the business and just, given their blood, sweat, and tears to it to say, it's okay. Failure is a part of life. Not everything is going to be, up. And I think that was another, big thing I learned from another therapist was, progress isn't always linear. It's not always going to be straight up. It's up and down and up and down. And just, I think the things that I've learned is when it, gets to that down point, I know it's going to get back up. And I know, what, I did before to, make sure that those, downward spirals don't, continue to go downward. And so I think to your point, you have to take care of yourself as that business owner. You need to take care of your mental health like you do your physical health, and you'll feel a lot better because, if you were not to go to the doctors for your body for 10 years, probably there's going to be a couple things wrong. And if you're not going to the doctors to, treat your brain at the end of the day, a lot of those, root causes of the things that are, keeping you up at night, the stress, the anxiety, the depression, they're not going to get solved. And so I
Yeah.
think that's been a really important thing just to really unpack, why I think the way that I do, why certain intrusive thoughts come more readily than others. And, then just you build those strategies to be able to deal with them and to be able to sit in that discomfort and know that it's going to get better because you've been through it before and you know that, you know, it can be a better situation. When I used to, do networking or have to do these different things, I would have panic attacks. It was really tough. I would be like, oh my God, there's so many people, like I can't talk to anyone. One of the biggest barriers always for me was just like starting conversations. Like
Yeah.
I didn't want to be like that person imposing myself on someone and just be like, hi, how are you? I was like, I don't know how to do that. Like I don't know small talk. Like it just was very difficult for me. And so, by getting, that mental health support, both from the therapy and the psychiatry aspect, made it easier for me. I take, anxiety medication before I'm going to go to a networking event. So that way I don't feel, that panic rising and can, kind of, have my, hormone levels be, more at that right level. And so I
Hmm.
think it's just important that you take care of your body and your mind because
Hmm.
if you're, like you said, burnt out, you're exhausted, you're not able to get out of bed, your business is going to suffer. And so I think that's a really important part is just, setting those boundaries and just, really taking care of your mental and physical health. And there's another HR consultant who shared this great. I love that he does this for his company. Everyone in the company is not allowed to respond to an email before 9 or after 5
Mm.
at all, across the board. Doesn't matter if it's the CEO or the new person, no one's allowed to. And I thought that was a really great way to kind of ingrain that work life balance in for the entire company. And
Yeah.
so I think that is another great example of like the things that we can do as well as business owners for our employees, for our team members. So that way they're able to bring their best self every day. They're not feeling drained and burnt out and feeling like, oh, I can't do this anymore. My boss doesn't understand. He's making me work, 7 a.m. to, midnight, and I've got kids I got to get on the bus in the morning. He was like, we recruit lots of parents who maybe they can't start at 9, but they can start at 10, and then they have to break for, get the kids off the bus at the end of the day. And that's a huge population that so many, organizations overlook because they just can't
Mm.
be in at 9 a.m. and they got to get their kids on the bus. And that's what they have to do. But they can do the work in between and they can do a great job at it, but they're just not given that opportunity. And so I really liked his mindset on that, was really like ingraining that work life balance within the culture, but also, showing people that you can be human. You can drop your kids off at school, you can pick them up from the bus, and it's not going to affect your job. That's something that, should be encouraged because, we're not robots. We have personal lives, we have things that affect, our business selves. And so to just kind of, think that those things don't affect each other is just, just kind of putting your hands over your eyes because you don't want to see it. It's just
Yeah.
it's there, and I think that's a really important thing. So yeah, just to wrap up, that question was really just taking care of yourself, mentally and physically, and really making sure that you give that yourself that grace. Be that good boss to yourself, and don't drive yourself into the ground, due to stress and worry and anxiety. There's ways to get support for that, and there are subject matter experts. I'm not saying that every therapist or psychiatrist is good. I've had my share of bad ones over the years. It took me a long time to find, ones that really understood, the way that I was thinking. And
Hmm.
I think that was really just beneficial in its own right, where my therapist wasn't saying, oh, you shouldn't worry about that. Just don't think about that. Now he's like, no, I think similarly to you. I also have OCD. So he's like, I also have OCD. I understand why you're thinking like that. This
Hmm.
is how you can do what you can do when those thoughts come. And so that I think was just so empowering for me, where it was like, okay, I'm not alone in this. It's not just
Yeah.
me that's having all these types of thoughts. There's other people that have very similar trains of thoughts. And so I think that was just really beneficial for me to understand, like, okay, it's not just me. There's other people that are dealing with these same challenges, and they're able to start, build their businesses, they're able to grow their businesses, they're able to be successful, and it's more of a kind of a superpower for them than it is something that's a detriment to them. So that's something that has been really key for me, and making sure that I can run this business for a long time and not have it affect me mentally or physically.
That's smart. That's smart. That's smart. Last question for you. The name of the show, of course, is the Relentless Pursuit of Winning podcast.
Yep.
So the question is, it's very simple, or I shouldn't say simple, but most people can define what winning looks like. It could be something small, it could be something huge. The challenge that a lot of people have is maintaining that relentless pursuit. What would you recommend to someone to help them maintain that relentless pursuit of winning?
No, great question. And, I apply, I think, a lot of things, on my youth lacrosse coaching side as well. It's important to, not give up. It's important to understand that even if it doesn't go right today, doesn't mean it's going to not go right the rest of the days. They always say
Hmm.
it's, darkest before the dawn. And so, if you're in that dark space and you're like, I don't know if I can get out of this, it's going to get better because it's been better in the past. And so I think that that's a really, a thing that is important when you have that relentless pursuit of winning is not let those failures stop you. Let that be an opportunity to learn. There's this great, I'm trying to remember the quote, but there's this great quote by Nelson Mandela around, he doesn't lose, every, every, lesson, it's a lesson that you learn. And I think that's,
Mhm.
really true. You can learn, so many things from the things that, didn't go right, the things that did go right. And I think it's just, really important to, just really give yourself that kindness, be that boss that you wish you would have been, that you wish you would have had. And, understand that, it's not the end of the world when, something doesn't go right. You can pick yourself back up. You can, use those, failures as, fuel to succeed in something else or to find those ways to be more successful in the future. And I think as well, something that's really important to me is, I want to help people. That's always been a big part of, me and my background. I want to help, make it easier for others. And so
Mhm.
with the free job seeker support that I do, I'm helping people through a really tough time and it, really fills me up, emotionally. And so I think it's important as well to figure out, what really helps you feel best at the end of the day. Some people are
Mhm.
money motivated, some people are, servant leaders and they want to help people. And so it's, I think, really important to just figure out, what really motivates you as an individual and what are the
Yeah.
things that, you look most forward to, the things that you don't look forward to. I, have the same conversations with my job seekers that I work with. What do you like about your job and what don't you like about your job? Well, if there's things that you don't like, let's see who, maybe within your business or outside of your business could take that lift off your shoulders. That way you don't have to do it anymore. And so that's been a really big thing of mine is just, kind of keep going. Just because you lost today doesn't mean you're going to lose the rest of your life. And, I thought a great example of that was I just wrapped up my spring rec season for my sixth, seventh grade team. And we had our end of the season lacrosse tournament and we had been the
Mhm.
number one team all season, all spring. And our first game of the tournament, we got blown out. It was
Oh,
like
no.
9-1 and they just, weren't ready to play
Mhm.
and we weren't ready. And so we had to win the rest of the games to get, to the championship. And so
Mhm.
we won the second game and we won it, in overtime. We won the third game and then we had to play back to back the same team that we lost to at the first game in the
Mhm.
championship. And we ended up losing 4-2 after losing to them 9-1 in the first game. And I told all the kids I'm, so proud of the way they bounced back and just pushed through it. And no one's gonna, I tell them, you're not gonna remember, if you won or lost this game, 20 years from now. You're gonna remember if you
Mhm.
had fun, if you worked hard, if you, gave it your all. And so that's something I always just try to help, those youth athletes understand that, it's okay to make mistakes. We're all gonna make mistakes. We're all gonna fail. It's about, what you do after that that really
Yeah.
defines you as a person. And I think that really, is the kind of impetus for a lot of things that I do. I've been at some of the darkest points in my life. Whether it's depression, anxiety. Been in really dark places, and so I think the fact that I'm able to come out of that and want to help other people, not just avoid those spaces, but understand that they can come back from them too. I think that's really what drives me, and just really trying to help make the world a better place than the one that I left it. So that's I think the fuel for me and what keeps that relentless pursuit of winning for me. I'm also just naturally a very competitive person. I love sports and was a lacrosse player for a number of years, so I really don't like to lose, but I've learned that you need to learn to lose and it's okay to lose because, you'll go but get them the next game or the next project or the next business and, not to treat those failures as, failures for you personally. Sometimes things happen and you just need to be able to pick yourself up, brush yourself off and, keep on moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. Justin, if somebody wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, of course. So I'm very accessible on LinkedIn, Justin Volman. You can find me on there. You can check out my website, volmanhrstrategy.com. My email is my last name and my first name at gmail.com. So again, super easy to find, but really accessible from the website, LinkedIn, or email. People can reach out to me any of those ways. So, whether it's a business struggling to attract, hire, or retain their talent, or a job seeker that's struggling in the job search, I'm happy to help in any way that I can.
Awesome. Awesome. Justin, thank you so much for being on the show. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot. I appreciate you and look forward to talking to you again soon, man.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Rick. It was, such a great experience and just always love having these conversations. And like you said, no one understands the stress of being an entrepreneur like a fellow entrepreneur. So always happy to, chat and see how we can, make it easier for that next generation.
Awesome. Awesome. And folks, thank you so much for watching or listening to another episode of the Relentless Pursuit of Winning podcast. We'll catch you next time.